the iHEA 2021 Centerpiece session on the economics of vaccine markets. I'm Audrey Laporte. We all know that vaccines have been one of the most successful public health interventions. They have saved countless lives. Yet, in the last number of years, we have experienced severe shortages of routine childhood vaccines. Those living in lower and middle income countries especially have had less access to vaccines than they should. And there are concerns that the R&D pipeline for vaccines is not as robust as it needs to be. COVID has brought many of these issues to the fore. It is my great pleasure to welcome our distinguished panel, who will share their insights into these and other issues, as well as how we may move forward to address them. First, I'd like to introduce Professor Michael Kramer, who received his PhD in economics from Harvard. He is a university professor in economics and public policy at the Kenneth C. Griffith Department of Economics at the University of Chicago. He is the 2019 co-recipient with Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee of the Sverige Riksbank Prize in Economic Sciences in memory of Alfred Nobel. He is a member of the National Academy of Sciences, a recipient of a MacArthur Fellowship and a Presidential Faculty Fellowship, and was named a Young Global Leader by the World Economic Forum. Professor Kramer's research focuses on poverty reduction with a particular focus on education and health. He helped develop the Advanced Market Commitment for Vaccines, which aims to stimulate private investment in vaccine research and the distribution of vaccines for diseases in the developing world. Next, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Hannah Kettler, the Director for Financing and Partnership at PATH's Center for Vaccines, Innovation and Access. In this capacity, she works with corporations, investors, donors, and global health nonprofits on structuring economic incentives, partnerships, and business frameworks to accelerate the sustainable development and introduction of essential medicines and vaccines. She is currently on secondment to the kovacs facility at Gavi. Prior to this, Dr. Kettler worked for the Global Health Program at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, most recently as the head of industry and leadership engagement on the Life Sciences Partnerships team. In this role, she managed the Gates CEO Roundtable, a coalition between the CEOs of 17 global pharmaceutical and diagnostics companies and foundation leadership. Dr. Kettler is a recognized authority and published author on policy incentives and partnership models to mobilize corporate investment in global health. She has a PhD in economics from the University of Notre Dame. We'll begin with a presentation by Professor Kramer, followed by a presentation by Dr. Kettler, and then we'll open things up for discussion. So please feel free to enter your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom application. Professor Kramer, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'll share my slides. Great. Can people see the slides? Great. Thanks. So I want to say this is a joint work with a group of, it draws heavily on joint work with a group of economists in the Accelerating Health Technologies group. On the left-hand side of the title slide, I've listed a few papers that we've brought out, but I'll also be referring to other work as well. Let me start with a bit of theory. And if we think about the problem of incentives for research and development in general, the patent system incentivizes innovation. And the way it does that is by rewarding inventors with temporary monopolies. And this is something that involves a trade-off. On the one hand, there's it can be a good way of rewarding innovation and this because the value, the reward for the innovation is at least roughly tied to willingness to pay for it. And it would be very hard to think in advance in many circumstances about what are the appropriate rewards for innovation. If you think about something like the Post-it note, we had no idea whether this would be useful to people. So tying that to how much people want it, it's not perfect, but it does reward innovations that turn out to be useful. But what's the disadvantage of this approach? Well, by rewarding inventors in this particular form with a monopoly, that's generally going to limit access. That's a problem in any period, but it's maybe a particularly strong problem during a pandemic, because governments are going to be motivated to solve the problem they have in the short run, and they're going to be looking for ways to expand access. So it's not clear that this is even an effective way that it's a politically sustainable way of rewarding innovation. And in the case of some goods, Post-it notes, if there's somebody has a temporary monopoly on Post-it notes, well, we get some deadweight loss and not enough Post-it notes are consumed. If we're talking about a vaccine, the consequences to human beings are much greater. So limiting access can be a substantial issue. Okay. Think of these things in general. There are lots of specific things about vaccines that come in. I'll come back to some of those later. But what I'd like to focus on is that it might be possible for vaccines to promote both innovation and access to vaccines. Why? Well, unlike some types of products, for vaccines, there are other possible ways to determine the value of innovation. Governments are usually the main customers for vaccines anyway. There's a regulatory system that tests for safety and efficacy. Vaccine can't even be sold without having undergone that process. And that means that we have some ways of determining the value of innovation rather than just seeing how much sells at the monopoly price. That opens up the possibility for writing contracts in advance that can incentivize both innovation and access to vaccines together. Let me be a little bit more specific. Let me start with one particular form of advanced contracting, and this is advanced market commitments, as, for example, in the pneumococcus advanced market commitment. So in advanced market commitments, governments or donors make a legally binding commitment that if a vaccine is developed that meets certain technical specifications, for example, more than 50% efficacious, safe enough to get through regulatory approval, you could add on to that list, that they'll help co-finance the initial purchases. So that helps incentivize innovation. If you want to get to the efficient level of access, well, then you're going to need to specify, there are various ways to do it, but one way to do it is to specify a price for an initial set of doses, to specify a tail price so that additional doses sell at something closer to marginal cost, and perhaps to specify that a certain amount of capacity has to be put in place to ensure that you get to the efficient quantity. Again, what's the efficient quantity for Post-it notes? We have no idea. What's the efficient quantity for malaria vaccine? Well, we have at least a rough idea. So, because presumably any vaccine that gets through regulatory approval is likely to be, if it's a childhood vaccine, it would probably be all children in areas with malaria. Obviously, lots of details. It's not easy, but it might be better than just rewarding through monopoly profits. Okay, so together with Rachel Glenister, and the notes are at the bottom of the page, we wrote a book called Strong Medicine that suggested this, actually focusing on the case of malaria. Then served on a panel, co-chaired a panel at the Center for Global Development, which tried to think about how to make this more concrete. And we recommended both a technologically distant target like malaria and a near-run target like pneumococcus. So pneumococcus is a major killer. There were already vaccines that covered the strains common in high-income countries, but not lower-income countries. A group of donors came together and pledged $1.5 billion to as top-up financing in addition to the basic payments. 3 vaccines were produced, and estimated the vaccines have been rolled out to low-income and lower middle-income countries much, much faster than is typical without this type of advanced commitment. And an estimated 700,000 lives have been saved. If you look at the very bottom of the page, you'll see a cite to a paper with Chris Snyder and John Levin that analyzed the experience of the pneumococcus advanced market commitment. So I think that suggests that at least provides an initial proof of concept that there's ways to avoid sort of the trade-offs that are inherent when you only have the option to either strengthen or weaken intellectual property rights, the trade-offs between incentives for vaccine development and trying to encourage access. With the right design, it's possible to encourage both, but it does require some financial commitment. Okay, that's one piece of evidence. Let me turn to the topic that's to a more recent topic, which is COVID-19, and was asked by some policymakers to think about how this approach could be adapted for COVID-19. Let me start out before discussing what we proposed. Let me discuss just some background of noting that there's a huge challenge during pandemics. And just to give a sense of this, there was a very nice survey done by the Center for Global Development of experts. This was in October 2020, not back at the beginning. This was not in March or April. This was not very far from when we actually got the first vaccines. Experts predicted only a 2% chance of a vaccine being approved by the end of 2020, and they thought we'd only have 115 million doses by the end of 2021. I think there were, obviously that prediction turned out to be, the truth turned out to be much better than that. But I think there were reasons why the experts were predicting this. They weren't just, they knew what they were true experts. They knew what they were talking about. First one is most vaccine candidates fail. So if you look at the chance that a vaccine going into phase 1 trials succeeds, it's pretty small. And that implies that if you want at least one successful candidate, you need many shots on goal. And second thing is that even after the vaccine's developed, it takes a long time to install the capacity. It's difficult, it's time consuming, and it's expensive. Very different from small molecules where lots of firms could set up generic factories. In fact, there's a saying in the vaccines that the process is the product. It takes years to construct new greenfield vaccine capacity and easily more than 6 months to repurpose existing capacity. So in this type of situation where normal timelines are many years, how can you accelerate vaccine production? Well, what a group of us recommended, and there's a New York, I put some sites to academic articles, but the time we got out a op-ed in the New York Times. And what we suggested was related to the previous approach, but a bit different. We suggested governments pay to install sufficient capacity to rapidly vaccinate people from each of many promising vaccine candidates. You need a lot of shots on goal. What would governments get in return? Well, they should get an option to buy successful vaccines because you want to install this capacity in parallel with testing, not wait till the testing is over. So it's not known which vaccines will be successful, but if it turns out to be successful, they should have the opportunity to buy that at a pre-specified price. Now, in fact, obviously governments didn't do exactly what we recommended, but the US and UK made approaches were fairly similar to this. They made large investments. I would argue that likely increased global production capacity substantially. And, one piece of evidence for that, although we'll never know for sure, we don't have a counterfactual, is if you look at the forecasts of experts, they thought much, much less could be done. But, there probably there is some supply elasticity, even in the short run, and we were able to produce more by investing. Just to give a sense of what the return to this is, we calculate that Operation Warp Speed would have paid for itself if it ended the pandemic just 12 hours sooner. You know, it's hard to wrap your head around the magnitude of numbers here. The IMF estimates the world's losing $500 billion per month due to the pandemic, just in short-run GDP losses. And that's why it's worth spending these billions of dollars that we're not used to spending for vaccines to address pandemics. A colleague of ours says this is the world's simplest cost-benefit calculation. You know, the trillions of benefits exceed the billions of investment costs. Unfortunately, we didn't invest enough. We estimate the social value of a vaccine at about of a course of capacity. The ability to produce, say, 2 doses in a year, as at about $1,400 at that stage in the pandemic, and there just wasn't while the U.S. and UK made big investments, there was insufficient capacity for the EU and many low and middle income countries. I think one key thing to note is that the social returns, this $1,400 per course, greatly exceed the private returns. So if you think about the price of a dose, that's something like $6 at the low end, say $40, price of a course, 2 doses. That's $6 at the low end, $40 at the high end. That is just, there's a huge gap between the social and private value. Why is that? Well, it's because in the middle of pandemics, it's inevitable that there's going to be restrictions on pricing. The world would not have let prices go to $1,400 per course. Companies knew that, they didn't even try, but if they had tried, there would have been government regulation. And that gap between private and social returns creates a very strong case for government subsidies of the type that we advocated and we saw. Okay, so what should we do? What should we do to prepare for the next pandemic? Well, during this pandemic, vaccine production was limited by capacity and by shortages of inputs. If we want to avoid that in the future, we need to invest now in sufficient standby capacity for both vaccines and inputs. So for vaccines, we don't know what disease it will be, so we can't stockpile the vaccines, but we can install standby capacity that could be repurposed to each of multiple candidates. We need not just standby capacity for the whole world, we need standby capacity for each of multiple platforms for the entire world. So that's a pretty big investment. For inputs, there's some things we could stockpile, but probably also additional. So whether that's lipids, whether that's bioreactors, all of this, installing that capacity and maintaining it, we should think about the capacity, not just the factory, but keeping it ready to be turned on, right away, or repurposed right away. That requires staff, that requires quality assurance checks. That's going to cost billions. But as pointed out earlier, trillions is a lot bigger than billions. So even if we're talking about, some people estimate a 2% annual pandemic risk, something in that magnitude, this is still going to have very high expected returns. But because we can anticipate that we're not going to see these $1,400 per course prices during a pandemic, that means that the private sector's probably not going to invest in this in the normal course of business. We need the public sector to generate the capacity to serve the peak load, which we hope will only happen in 2% of years. That's going to require a public subsidy to keep that open. And I think that's a very high return investment, and that's something that was part of the panel advising the G20, and you may have seen Larry Summers or others talking about this, Ngozi, Tharman. These are, I think this is a very high return investment. But I sound like a TV pitchman here. That's not all. We don't just, the most important thing is the direct effect of the extra supply during a pandemic. But I think there's an extra benefit as well. If we think about one of the unfortunate things of this pandemic was that governments imposed export bans, arguably many hoarded vaccines. There's very strong incentives to do that in a shortage situation. The value is so much greater than the price, governments are going to do that. There was sort of moral objection to that, which I totally understand and sympathize with. But that's probably not going to solve the problem. Politicians are responsible to their constituents. That has a second follow-on pernicious consequence, which is it may lead countries to focus exclusively on domestic production. But because that's very risky, because the chance of success with any one candidate vaccine is very small. This time it turned out that many approaches succeeded. That's very unusual. We could be, even large countries like the US could easily back the wrong candidates and then be stuck in the cold. I think what we need to do is to change the incentives of politicians. And you can do that if you put in sufficient standby capacity and stockpiles to avoid shortages. If there aren't shortages, then there won't be these export bans and hoarding. That may sound theoretical, but I think we've seen exactly that if you think about PPE. In the early days of the pandemic, there were shortages and there were export bans, there was hoarding of PPE. We're not seeing that. Nobody worries about restrictions on trade in masks anymore because there's now adequate supply. So how do you assure adequate supply? Well, we need both national and global efforts. National efforts to build up capacity will actually create positive externalities for other countries. In the COVID case, in the short run, when supply might be pretty inelastic, you can argue the case either way about whether this generates positive or negative externalities for other countries. If we're thinking about pandemic preparedness, long-run supply elasticities should be pretty flat. In other words, if Germany decides to put in a lot of stockpiles and standby capacity, that's not hurting Australia. Australia can do the same. There might be just physical limits on pricing on capacity in the short run, but not in the long run. We also need multilateral efforts, partly for lower income countries, which probably are not going to be able to afford to do this, but partly for all of us. It doesn't make sense for every household to put in place their own fire department. Rather, we band together and we say we're going to pay for a fire department, and the fire department's going to go to the place that gets hit by a fire. And if several places get hit by a fire, well, they'll have to make some triage decisions based on where the need is greatest. That's something that is actually a global public good and that we could put in place. And I think rather than simply allocate vaccines in proportion to population, behind the veil of ignorance, since we don't know where the next pandemic will hit worst, we could probably agree on some procedure for allocation of vaccines. Okay. Let me conclude by just with one final issue, which is I think it's very useful, very helpful to use the tools of economics to think about where the gaps between social and private R&D incentives will be largest. And I'd like to talk about one issue which I think is actually critical policy issue for the COVID pandemic right now, and I think is also critical to think about for future pandemics. So this graph shows on the horizontal axis, the mean neutralizing antibody level, i.e. the immune response for various vaccine doses. On the vertical axis, it shows the efficacy. And you can see that's a very tight relationship. This was pointed out in an article by Corey et al. We're just taking their graph. I want to show you something else, which is I'll just add to this, the immune response. We don't know the efficacy level, but I'll add the immune response for alternative doses, for lower doses and some higher doses for each of these vaccines. And you can see what the predicted efficacy level would be. We don't know for sure that this would be the actual efficacy level. Let me emphasize that. Okay, here you can see that, take Moderna up there at the top. You can see that if 50% of the existing standard dose was actually be very efficacious, as predicted efficacy would be very high. Actual, we don't know about. Even 25% of the standard dose, also very high predicted efficacy, well over, above 90%. Maybe not well over, but above 90%. This is not dispositive evidence, but it suggests that it might be a realistic possibility that we could double or even quadruple our production of some vaccines with the existing capacity in place. Definitely think we should be investing in more capacity even at this late date, but we should pursue all shots on goal. And this might be a very promising one. It's not just Moderna, several other vaccines look this way, and we could collect more data on others. So not arguing the world should switch over to a new dose tomorrow, but I do think that the learning about this it would be a very, very high return investment. That could be further immunogenicity studies for a variety of vaccine and dose combinations. That would take weeks and just a few hundred healthy volunteers. Very hard to see a reason not to do that. You could do this in a place without disease transmission, since you're just looking at immune response. Another step would be jurisdictions could decide to implement this type of fractional dosing based on the existing evidence, or they could do trials as part of vaccine rollouts. This is very similar to what the UK did for first doses first. The evidence wasn't that different. Right now in Brazil, there's a trial going on with half doses of AstraZeneca vaccine. And 35,000 residents of Viana says it's starting soon. That's actually out of date. It's already started. If this type of approach doesn't work, then the participants could get full doses. If efficacy is high, fractional dosing could be implemented very broadly. We've been talking to scientists. This obviously out of the economists don't have real expertise in this. We've got a very positive response from scientists and actually from a lot of policymakers as well. There's a site to our recent paper, which would be on our website, for example. But a key issue, it looks like, is whether vaccine manufacturers will allow this or will seek to block this type of trial. There are downsides for manufacturers in trying this, and the upsides are limited because there's such a big gap between the private value and social value of vaccines. Okay, let me conclude. I think there's potential to reform incentives for R&D to enable wide access. I think if we're just talking about strengthening or weakening intellectual property rules, we're trading off two very important objectives. But with advanced contracting, those can be designed to achieve both objectives, at least for vaccines. We could think about other approaches like patent buyouts for therapeutics. If we want to prepare for the next pandemic, we need to invest in production capacity in advance. And that would also help reduce incentives for some of the vaccine nationalism that we've seen. The vaccine nationalism may still be there, but there won't be incentives for the counterproductive, the prisoner's dilemma type actions among countries. And then finally, we need global public support for research that has high global social returns, but lower commercial and national returns, like alternative dosing, like research on better ways to use non-pharmaceutical interventions, like mix and match. There's a whole host of areas where current incentives are very far from optimal. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Kramer. Dr. Kettler. You're up.
Great. Thank
Sorry.
you. I'll share as soon as Michael's. Super. Okay, let me share my screen. And just as I'm doing that, there we go. I just want to reinforce, I think, Michael's point about the pursuit of activities in parallel is really important. And so at the same time that there's a lot of focus on manufacturing capacity right now, this idea about not falling behind on the question of research questions and really leveraging, there's a ton of investment that was made in clinical development capacity, et cetera. And so really building on that to explore all avenues, I very much support, and I think his work is really exciting in that regard. So thank you for that. So as I'm, luckily nobody's hired me to be a Zoom expert. Come on. All right. Can everybody see my screen? Great. So I'm going to build off of a lot of what Michael has already commented on and focus in again on this question of how to use financing, other incentive tools to really advance the goal for global access to vaccines. And I too am going to dig in specifically to the question of COVID-19 and spend some additional time on kovacs in particular, which is the multilateral response that has been set up and is currently in execution to try to accelerate global access for COVID-19 vaccines, and to think about, you know, what can we learn from kovacs in particular as we think forward to how do we prepare for future pandemics. Just a couple of key takeaways just as a kickoff to start this conversation. Number one, you know, a national solution was not an option, and we need global solutions, global access to tools. Again, this builds off of a lot of Michael's comments, but you know, when you look at the total numbers, you look at the dynamic now, as you look at countries that have vaccines and those that don't, it's clear that we're not all collectively going to resolve and address and move beyond this pandemic unless we have a global approach to resolving it. Second point is that the COVID vaccine response built very heavily on the experience of global health work that's been ongoing for decades. It's thinking about financing tools, the incentives. I'll comment also, but Michael reinforced and has been a great generator of over the years. Institutions, funders, ecosystems. Again, there was a lot to play with when we got started, so we didn't have to start from scratch, and I think that's really important. Similarly, in the pandemic flu space, we also had a lot of lessons to build off of. Through the idea of kovacs, so this multilateral collaborative approach, at the same time that there was a real global race going on to try to develop vaccines as quickly as possible, it was matched with a focus on how do we race to deliver to all. And I think that's also really important learning, that we weren't going to look at the question of delivering globally in sequence, that we're really going to pursue this in parallel and make sure to best as we could that we were ready to start to deliver at the point at which vaccines were developed. And finally, just to reinforce, and again, the numbers are really hard to get heads around, but this is the largest vaccine rollout in history. We've had a lot of starts and stops, some progress, and then it feels like, you know, it's really challenging to make progress. But you know, this is unprecedented, as is often a word used for COVID-19. And as much as we've made a lot of progress, we still have a long way to go. So just, you know, this is not news to any of you, but again, just kind of the significant volume of cases. I used this slide just a couple months ago, and I, you know, had to add, I think it was 40,000 additional cases, another, you know, 1 million deaths. These numbers as far as GDP losses are well outdated, but just a huge, significant global impact from this pandemic, and a clear role, therefore, for a COVID vaccine. It was recognized right away that there's a massive economic and health benefit to be realized from really actively investing and pursuing vaccines as part of the package of solutions to address. And, you know, there's a lot of attention on the economic impacts, the externality impact on all of our health delivery systems. I just want to reinforce also, coming from the global health world, just how significant and devastating this has been also for all the ongoing programs that have been going on, the investments that have been going on for years. So this is a quote from Bill Gates from, you know, almost a year ago, but still holds probably and then some, how quickly the work that has been ongoing has had to been traded off with an attention on of healthcare workers, delivery systems, et cetera, financing to fight COVID. And so the urgency to get beyond COVID is so high, not only so that we all can take masks off and travel, but obviously so that we can resume and really kind of make up for the losses that we've realized in some of these really critical global health programs. So again, this is not a new area. There's been a ton of work done on this question of how do you accelerate vaccine access. Clear, different types of strategies have been developed over the years to try to address different types of problems. The malaria and pneumo cases that Michael brought up, key distinguishing there is that in the malaria case, markets are insufficient to really drive the investment in innovation that we need. In the case of pneumococcal vaccine, and I apologize, there's a garbage truck going on by my house just as I'm speaking. On the pneumococcal side, there actually was enough of a global market to motivate the investment in R&D by the private manufacturers, but not enough incentive to really target low and middle income countries at the same time. And so these are different characteristics of access challenges. And in response, there's been a lot of work done by multiple partners in the ecosystem of global health to try to address through combinations. The incentives frameworks that have been put in place look at things from a push and a pull perspective, push being one of kind of direct funding to mitigate immediate risks and costs, pull to create a more predictable demand, more certainty as far as what the market's going to look like, leveling the playing field. Regulatory harmonization is an example, but really addressing barriers that all manufacturers might face in engaging in a specific disease area, and the importance of combinations of tools. So the advanced market commitment was very much perceived as a pull, but it was complemented by product development partnership investments that allowed for additional companies to get into the pneumococcal space and in turn respond to the AMC once they had gotten a product approved. And so sort of figuring out what's the right combination of tools. And this is important when we turn to the COVID-19 example. Michael spent a lot of time on this, so I won't go into detail, but again, the advanced market commitment is also important. I highlighted Gavi here. Gavi was the key executing partner and key member of the partnership. Was established, it's just passed its 20-year anniversary and has been actively engaged with other UNICEF and other partners, World Health Organization, in getting vaccines to low and middle income countries at affordable prices. And this is a really critical example of infrastructure and institutions that existed that we in turn could take advantage of immediately at the point at which it was clear that COVID-19 was going to become a pandemic. Just to flag, again, the idea that there were two manufacturers in the AMC case that were already close to market, if not had a product on the market. And it took a while for this third supplier to enter. It has and did benefit somewhat from the AMC funds. But again, that third supplier also benefited significantly from push funding in order to be able to respond to the new markets that the AMC helped create. And this also Michael alluded to, but just to reinforce, a key goal of the AMC really was to say, we don't want a system where, a manufacturer introduces a vaccine, they get a return on that investment, they pay back against all of their R&D costs, and then they invest in additional capacity, and we wait years potentially for those vaccines to reach the poorest in developing countries. So a key factor and feature of the AMC, and also all the work that's gone on in the COVID space, was what can we do to accelerate such that we have much closer to global launches of vaccines, and how do you motivate the manufacturers to make the investments necessary to meet the capacity needs to do so. So this is kind of a good diagram to capture what's possible with these types of incentive tools. So COVID-19, somewhat like a pneumococcal situation, but not. The disease definitely needs and requires a global solution. You need global action simultaneously, which again is very different from pneumococcal. And there's different types of risks, and we can talk through those in the discussion, but in particular, you need to make these at-risk investments early, to Michael's point, otherwise we'll be behind. But we also don't know what demand will look like. Lots of people hope we all get 1 or 2 shots and we're done. We may need boosters, though. We may need totally new vaccines in the event variants really undermine the efficaciousness of current vaccines. And so how companies think about the investment opportunity for COVID is quite different than how they think about a stable market for pneumococcal disease in particular. So, to reinforce that a huge significant investment was made in developing products, investing in at-risk manufacturing capacity, and at the same time, there was a real urgency placed on, we can't let the market solve for equitable access. And we know the vaccine's only the first step. We anticipate, and unfortunately are still struggling with, this huge gap between wealthy and low-income countries receiving vaccines. Something we've also seen that I think is interesting to point out is all vaccines are not created equal. It was a first and really notable that we have so many different vaccines that have been approved from different platforms, but we also see they're not all equal. And so we are seeing some preference start to just be demonstrated by countries, and that impacts also how you equitably distribute. The nationalism threats and realities that Michael spoke to, I think, are critical. And this all really lends itself to a multilateral effort, that effort being one of trying to bridge the gap between those who have the funds and are making the early contracts and those who ultimately really need also those vaccines in order for the globe to move forward. Kovacs, most of you are probably familiar with, so I'm not going to spend a lot of detail talking through this partnership, but really critical, again, the composition of partners. CEPI is a group of public-private partnership that has been doing R&D and manufacturing scale-up investment. Gavi, well-established organization in pooling and market shaping, working with manufacturers to secure affordable prices. UNICEF, also a very active, well-established, the established procurement agent in the vaccine space. World Health Organization as a normative body. So bringing all these pieces together, essentially trying to string together what are all the end-to-end capacities that we need in place in order to try to get ahead of what we knew would be some delivery challenges once vaccines were available. So COVAX is a combination of tools. It's a fund, it invests in a portfolio, it undertook some at-risk manufacturing investment. Critical, it has an allocation framework that really kind of proactively involves in what do we do with vaccines when we have them. And then also, proactively invested in other things that they thought might stand in the way, like indemnity and liability agreements, regulatory pathways, et cetera. And so, these are all steps that COVAX has taken and brought together in a package of tools to try to advance and address risks and issues that are holding up the rollout of vaccines globally. And at the same time, as you're thinking through what do you do to make sure those vaccines are moving forward, so product preparedness, there's also investment in country preparedness, thinking through what do countries need to be ready in order to take up vaccines once they're available. So diagrammatically, a key feature that builds on the past experience, both of Gavi, to some degree the AMC as well, just the critical role of pooling, right? It's pretty straightforward, but the idea of bringing as many participants as you could into the pool, that increases the funding, but also increases the shared reliance, if you will, and buy-in to the success of COVAX. And so on one hand, it creates an ability for COVAX to bid competitively for vaccine. And from the manufacturer standpoint, it then in turn represents a significant demand. And so by going to COVAX, it's an effort for them to get sufficient and credible, predictable volumes. And I would add that, early on, we didn't know which tool would work. And COVAX was intentionally looking to build a pipeline by taking bids from multiple different companies. So what has worked, again, this speaks for itself, but it's usually 10 years. We've gotten multiple candidates in less than one. We don't have to go into the details of this. The key thing is 18 vaccines are now in use. I mean, this is in less than a year. So that is, something one would never have expected with 4 different platforms. There was, reference to manufacturing capacity. The left is, an estimate of, up to 6 billion of pre-pandemic supply. we're now talking about scenarios that, start at the low end of 6 billion only for COVID vaccine. So we've had a huge significant investment. That doesn't speak to whether we have enough or not, but it does demonstrate a huge investment in supply, as well as global distribution. This is for COVAX, but 135 countries have received doses. And I think this is even as much important. And this slide was really exciting 3 months ago, and now it's almost more kind of heartbreaking because we got a really fast start and then had some obstacles come in the way. But in less than 90 days from its introduction in high-income countries, COVID vaccines were being introduced globally, and that's a huge accomplishment that we've never had with any other vaccine. And the COVAX has also been successful in raising funds and has invested and signed deals with multiple candidates. So a lot of its tactics and strategies have moved ahead and are doing well. However, we also know that we do not currently have equitable distribution of vaccines. And the key challenge, and I'm not going to walk through this slide in detail, but supply shortages is something that gets a lot of attention. And there's both kind of absolute shortage, do we have enough globally, but very much so this is about a distributive shortage where a lot of the doses that do exist are locked into bilateral deals that were negotiated early in countries where the vaccines were being developed. And so you end up with a scenario that COVAX was able to muster and pull together resources to buy significant volumes, but not with the in order such that they were prioritized. So there's a lot of waiting, even as the doses have been secured, they have not been forthcoming. This just to highlight, how concentrated currently the vaccines are. China primarily relying on their own supplied and manufactured vaccine, but then US, India, others, a really high concentration of where vaccines currently being administered, and just how the rest of the world still is really waiting. Again, this is highlighted here. So, as much as we had a fair allocation mechanism that's part of COVAX, and I think it might be interesting to discuss, how do you modify or address that allocation mechanism? To be fair, you can only allocate if you have vaccines to allocate. And so at a point at which COVAX has locked in significant volumes, more than 2 billion, which was its target, as far as those doses becoming available, there's been quite a significant delays, some of which might have been anticipated and some not. And so in the short term, there's really active work going on to figure out, are there ways to redistribute the vaccines such that we get more going towards the poorest countries at a time when many of the high-income countries have vaccine rates slowing. They're kind of sitting on vaccines waiting to see, will they need boosters? There's a pent-up demand for those right now. And so there's been an active work by COVAX to facilitate dose donations. And most importantly, and I think the temporal issue cannot be kind of understated, vaccines needed now. So it's not a promise to donate sometime. There's a huge gap right now as far as making vaccine available. And so you can see there's been some response from countries, and there's anticipation there'll be more donations that come forward over the next few weeks. And then beyond donation, there's also been some exploration. Are there other ways to continue to redistribute and reallocate vaccine? Reselling in particular has come up as a mechanism potentially to look at the idea of a marketplace where COVAX facilitates trades and sales. These are very early concepts, and so I want to reinforce these are not mechanisms currently in place, but again, with some creativity, thinking through what's the best way we can accelerate equal distribution and allocation, given the current urgency in key geographies. So just as far as thinking forward and the implications of COVID, both for global health, I think it's important again early on to say COVID-19 benefited quite a lot from pre-existing experience and investment from global health. There's a lot from COVID that will benefit global health going forward. Billions invested in new vaccine platforms. We've got a proof of concept with mRNA that we did not have before, that now we can build on. We've got streamlined approaches to clinical trials, regulatory pathways, et cetera. So real hopeful that we can benefit and leverage this type of investment that's been made and experience learned in an effort to try to go back and have malaria, TB, other vaccine priorities accelerated as a benefit of all these investments. And then for future pandemics, and this is where Michael also ended and provided some really important insights, just very concretely, the question of what kind of allocation framework, again, what needs to come together in advance with agreement such that we are pursuing a shared goal as it relates to distribution of vaccine when they become available, when we need them. And then a whole host of other more micro level accomplishments that hopefully will also benefit us the next time we need them. And, I think the final question to end, and maybe this will kick off the discussion too, but, kovacs really was designed to avoid a delay, right? And to be fair, the time that's passed has been relatively few months, but because of the nature of the pandemic, the implications of delay have been so significant that we really are all committed and interested to look at what else can we do such that there's equity in immunization globally for COVID now, but also for vaccines going forward. So with that, I will stop.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We have some really great questions from our audience. I'm just going to pluck one here. The US relaxed the IPR rules concerning production of COVID vaccines in other countries. What else should the US and other advanced countries do in the future? And I'll just throw that out to both of our speakers, and so whichever one would like to jump in.
I'm not exactly sure what it's meant by having relaxed IP rules. I mean, there's definitely been some signaled interest in exploring via the World Trade Organization what are the different opportunities that you can use IP and rules through the WTO to accelerate access, but there may be something specific that I'm just not thinking of off the top of my head. Michael, do you?
Yeah, I would say, I'm assuming that this is referring to the US support for the measures in the WTO. So I'll take Hannah's interpretation on that.
Yeah.
And I think I would make 2 points. The first one is, as I was saying before, I think both R&D incentives and access are really important. And I think we need measures that are going to stimulate both. And I think if we're only focusing on adjusting the current level of IP protection up and down, we're inevitably going to have trade-offs between the two. And, this might be one of those cases. So I would suggest thinking about alternative approaches that could do both, which is basically paying for both access for both for the products or for the R&D and for the access, rather than rewarding innovators with a monopoly. That said, I think there's some specific things about vaccines that further complicate this. So if we're talking about most therapeutics, the IP is really important. And if the IP is available, then generic producers can start entering, and they can do so in relatively quickly by normal timescales. For vaccines, it's not, I don't want to say IP has no role, but there's also a lot of protection for the initial producer through technical know-how. It's precisely because it's so difficult to produce vaccines. And we've seen that, we've seen that in extreme form, which is producers couldn't even transfer the technology from themselves to themselves, with these big delays in Europe because they got one factory working, but they couldn't get the other factory working right away. So if we really want to expand access, then we need to go beyond just saying, well, we're going to address IP, we're going to relax IP and think that's going to solve it. We have to actually incentivize, we either have to mandate or incentivize firms to share the technology. Well, mandating, that's a hard problem, because if you force somebody to do something they don't want to do and it's about tech transfer, that's, it's hard to make sure they do it. So I would personally think that, personally, I think we just need more vaccine production, and that more vaccine production contributes hugely to equity. If the queue to get vaccines is 2 years long and you cut that queue in half, then that has a small benefit for the person, for the person at the end of the queue, they go from 2 years to 1 year. For the person 2 weeks into the queue, they go from 2 weeks to 1 week. So increasing production would be very helpful. I think we want to do that through every method at our disposal. And that could include finding ways to encourage that tech transfer. And basically, if we pay for more production, that would be a way to encourage that tech transfer. And I think that could be done in a way that wouldn't discourage future R&D and create situations like we've seen now, where some of the big vaccine producers actually did not substantially enter this market, which is something that which is a tragedy. So I think we should. Getting access is a critical issue, but I think we should do it in a way that doesn't undermine research incentives.
And just to add to that, I think to build on the point about the tech transfer, the organizations such as CEPI, PATH, the Gates Foundation, many others have invested in supporting both the licensee and the licensor in the tech transfer process. And so I think also learning from what worked and what didn't. I think Michael's comment about the relative experience of manufacturers as far as managing complex global networks is really important. Again, lessons learned from there in terms of what's feasible and how do you support. So continue to support global health partnerships that do have expertise in tech transfer and knowledge transfer alongside the investments necessary to motivate manufacturers, I think is also a really critical opportunity for the U.S. to continue to accelerate that work. And then thinking geographically as well, what's feasible, and again, with an eye to building out capacity that really can respond in the time frame we'll need them to.
Okay, fantastic. We have a question from Philip Clark, who is asking Professor Kramer, a key problem will be finding a long-term way of financing investments in the continuing global rollout of COVID-19 vaccine to low and middle income countries and in future pandemic preparedness. What do you think of a tax on international airline travel as a way of dealing with the negative externality of global population mixing?
So I think global population mixing is fantastic, and I'd love to see more of it. I don't like carbon emissions, however. So, I'm not an expert in that area. So, there might be a, so I could easily imagine that some sort of system to either, I'm not enough of an expert to say whether it should be a tax system or some other system, but the world needs to deal with the carbon problem, and maybe that could be used to finance global public goods, but that's going to be very, very politically challenging, is my sense, and at least in some countries like my own. And so, one thing I would add to Hannah's great discussion is that as we seek a international system that's fair, we also have to think about what will be incentive compatible for the countries to sign up to. In other words, we don't have an international government, so countries have to agree to participate in things. How do we structure something that's going to create incentives for countries to participate? That's a very tricky problem. I do think that there's scope to do that simply because the gains from cooperation on pandemic preparedness are so high, as Hannah pointed out. It is something that requires global solutions. So, but whether an air traffic tax is the right way to do that or not, I don't know. Let me just explain something about global mixing. In general, and in peacetime, so to speak. I think there are huge benefits of international trade and international contact and exchange. Obviously some, in the middle of a pandemic, some restrictions may be needed, but I personally think we've probably gone way overboard on those restrictions. And I think too much emphasis has been placed on some very costly non-pharmaceutical interventions, including some of the travel restrictions that are in place, when other more effective and less socially costly non-pharmaceutical interventions are available. So I'm not sure heightening global travel restrictions is the best way to go.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. This is a question for Hannah. It's a common view, and there's evidence that the kovacs mechanism is underperforming in achieving the expected objectives. You discussed some of the demand side factors, but what about supply side factors? Is the manufacturing capacity ready to supply if enough funds are raised for the scheme? Would voluntary licensing of some innovators help solve the supply side problems? And which actions should global actors, governments, and global stakeholders take to fix the underperformance of the kovacs program? So there you go. Small question for you, Hannah.
I saw it in the chat. I was thinking like maybe I'd take it off and write an article on it. Thanks. Well, just a couple of things. Demand side factors. So I guess what I would say as far as capacity in particular, so there has been, and Michael, and he didn't refer to it in detail here, but he has done some work on some of the associated issues, such as having inputs and kind of sufficiently adequately capacity within the supply chains in order to respond as and when capacity is needed. I mean, what we've observed in the immediate term, as far as deals having been done, but then supply not being forthcoming, is a combination of, for example, I think a really active step was taken to facilitate tech transfer to Serum Institute of India, for example, for AstraZeneca, also for Novavax, with the anticipated goal of really being able to scale capacity quickly and designate capacity to the broader AMC community, or AMC countries, which is what we reference to the 92 poorest. But due to the development of the disease in India, there's been a need to reassign those vaccines and focus specifically currently on domestic supply. And so that was an instance of maybe on reflection saying, okay, we didn't have a distributed sufficient supply sourcing strategy, but also recognize we've been in this for only 6 months, and all of this stuff, as far as where else do you go for capacity, I think some really smart bets were placed early, and then some things outside of COVAX's control have held things up. There have also been a couple of vaccines that anticipated regulatory approval that haven't not yet met that, and so again, the strategy of having a portfolio makes sense. A vaccine like Novavax has not yet been approved for one specific example. Similarly, Sanofi, these are two examples where there are deals in place, but not yet vaccines. So some of it is just kind of the risks associated with supply are playing out in very live fashion as it relates to COVAX. There is been something that's referred to as the manufacturing task force that was established in early April with engagement from and leadership from the WHO and CEPI, as well as Gavi, with a really targeted focus on how do you address short, medium, and long-term manufacturing gaps, and how do we get ahead of it so that as countries come online and are in a position to take, and I would be very clear right now, there's pent-up demand. Like, we're not talking about at the moment a situation where some countries will have potentially absorptive issues, but right now the issue is just kind of absence of supply. So what can we do to continue to advance what are supply plans with actual realization of supply? And some of that, again, is a marketplace to ensure that those who need inputs are matched up with those who have, working in that kind of space, fill finish, again, matchmaking in that context, workforce training. On the long-term side, the WHO is very actively looking, and I saw there's a number of questions around the question of, facilitating tech transfers with the goal to building up regional capacity. So there's kind of a broad portfolio of activity under exploration, and in some cases already in execution to try to get ahead of short, medium, and long-term supply gaps. And alongside that, and I don't know, many of the people who I can't see, of course, participants are familiar with ACT-A as a global government and multilateral forum. There is a vaccine manufacturing working group with a set of country representatives co-led by Germany and South Africa. There's an initiative at the African Union, a huge amount of attention right now on how do we make sure manufacturing is not the limiting factor. And as far as what can governments do, there is a dialogue between the task force and this working group to try to align countries who are really interested in making investments short and longer term with kind of the analysis and identifying what's been identified as gaps so that we can try to match up interest with need as it relates to manufacturing supply. So.
Okay, and one last question. Do either of you see a risk that with the emergence of infectious disease of the form of COVID, that investment in the kind of broad portfolio of vaccines could be skewed towards infectious disease that has significant negative externalities for people living in wealthier countries, to the disadvantage of vaccines that are aimed at diseases that have significant but more localized impacts in lower and middle income countries?
I would have thought that there's complementarities. One of the great things about science and technology is economies of scale. This is a point, made very clearly and eloquently by Paul Romer. A basic technology, this is mostly thought of within technologies, that a technology that's, once a technology is developed, you can, it's very expensive to develop the technology, but once it's developed, from a technological standpoint, it can be used by many different people at fairly low cost. We need to get our institutions right to have that happen, which is a key part of this, this whole hour. But that actually also applies across technologies, because often the things that are needed for the scientific developments that are needed for one goal actually help with another. And in this particular case, I don't think we can, I'll add a note of caution to this, but at some level, being prepared, having the capacity in place, the stockpiles in place, the factories in place to produce for a pandemic means that it should be easier, not harder, to produce to serve routine needs, because we won't have we're not going to have pandemics every year. The note of caution is some people think we can finance that somehow we can snap our fingers and some magic happens and we can finance the full peak load capacity for the next pandemic by doing it through dual use. I don't think that's, I think we're gonna, if there's no free lunch, I don't think we can get all the way there. But there might be a discount on the lunch in the sense that this would make it a little bit cheaper to cover other health needs that we have on a continuing basis, and then things could be potentially switched over during a pandemic. Many, the details of that depend on the technology, how storable vaccine is, many other things. But at least there's some hope that it should make it easier rather than harder. So I'd hope for complementarity, not.
Yeah, no, and just to add, I think that's a really interesting question. I think the other hopeful positive outcome from this pandemic is going to be the establishment of new players, new manufacturers in the space. And so through tech transfer, there are companies, a couple of Chinese companies just got pre-qualification for vaccines through WHO that they hadn't had before. Other companies are coming online with additional vaccines. So there's a lot of learning going on within the vaccine production network. And hopefully that is going to build up the level, not only of the volume of capacity owned by multinationals, but ideally also the kind of level of experience and capacity within the network. And I think the interesting question I don't have the answer to, but what I would maybe I'll go back to when my other day job starts again is really like, what are the sustainable business models for these manufacturers, and what role, to Michael's point, do these potential, I don't know, I think there's a reference to niche diseases that are disproportionately impact the poorest. And niche, I don't mean malaria, but maybe some of the pneumococcal, other pneumo diseases that are smaller and more regional. Some of the diarrheal diseases, again, tend not to be global, but regional. Are there, market business opportunities for companies that are gaining a lot of experience to move into those spaces? And again, that's a complement. That doesn't mean they're then going to switch over to pandemic vaccine supply at the point at which everyone doesn't have to have a turnkey capacity that turns over to be in pandemics. But I hope that by investing in manufacturing, tech transfer, knowledge transfer, but also just kind of capacity, that's going to have a positive externality on our ability to build out multiple different sort of business offerings, if you will, in the vaccine space. I'm not naive. They're still going to need donor funding. I mean, and there is competition for donor funding. So I don't want to pretend like this is magically all going to become, a business proposition, but I do think there'll be some hope, some benefit from that. I think the one risk will be competition for donor funding and aid, and kind of continuance attention on value for money of investing in some of these other diseases. How do you balance that with the value for money of the risk of needing capacity earmarked for future pandemics? And all of you in the room, and Michael in particular as well, are better placed to do that assessment than I am, but I think that's a critical thing to think through too.
Thank you so much. Reference was made to Larry Summers, who recently said that pandemic preparedness is akin to governments having a chance to buy Amazon stock in the 90s. And I think both of our speakers have made a very strong case that vaccine preparedness is a critical part of that strategy, and if structured correctly, could yield enormous returns on a global scale. So I thank them both so much, and I thank all of you for joining us today, and I wish you a wonderful day and wonderful rest of conference. Thank you so much. Bye-bye now.